There was a small church at Tunstall before 1100 AD, and almost certainly before the Conquest, probably built of wood. It was founded as one of the daughter churches of the Minster Church of Milton. Tunstall Church is dedicated to St John the Baptist and was built on a rise to the south of Sittingbourne. Today it is surrounded by fine old trees. On the north side of the church is a yew, which is thought to be about 1,000 years old because of its girth of at least 24 feet. The ancient part of the churchyard has been raised higher by hundreds of years of burials. A more permanent church to replace the wooden pre-conquest church may have been built in the late 1100s. In the 1300s, Archbishop Peckham restored the chancel of carved stone at his own expense, and this must have meant virtually rebuilding it, as no earlier work remains. Tunstall's nave was completely rebuilt in simple style during the 14th century, as were the tower and the porch. During the late 15th century, 3 new 3-light windows were put in at the east end of the north aisle, and a large new 5-light east window was made in 1510. The southeast chapel is usually called the Hales Chapel or Lady Chapel, and has been associated with the lords of the manor for hundreds of years. Outside the porch door, a few feet to the west, is the table tomb of a priest believed to be dated from about 1500. There are similar tombs in this position in Borden and Bredgar. It is not known whose tomb it was, but a cross etched on the stone signifies its clerical status. It is the beautification of the church in the 19th century which gives it its colourful look today.
The interior is impressive, with beautiful choir stalls and 12 Victorian stained glass windows, creating a warm, contemplative atmosphere.
A brass in memory of the Reverend Wolfe, rector of Tunstall, who died in 1525, survives in the church. Wolfe was buried in the chancel as he wished, with the small brass marking the spot. A rubbing of it hangs at the back of the church. Wolfe's will reveals him as a devout, well-travelled, well-educated and well-off priest. He left many bequests and orders for a funeral feast at Tunstall. Bread and beer for the poor, a fat bullock and 6 capons for dinner for the gentlemen. In addition, he bequeathed 2 shillings to every couple in his parish, 8 pence to every single person and 4 pence to every child. The Cromers became lords of the manor of Tunstall in the 15th century, and their name is still brought to mind locally by Cromers Road. It was during the Cromers' time here that the manor became centred on their new house at Grove End. There is a handsome memorial in the Hales Chapel to one of the Cromers, Sir James, who died in 1613. This memorial has had a troubled history. It was dismantled and carted off by a Hales descendant around 1847. She intended it to be placed in Hales Place Catholic Chapel near Canterbury. This was never done. It was later abandoned in a stonemason's yard, and the figure of the 4th daughter was lost. In the early years of the 20th century, the Reverend Crusoe of Tunstall discovered it there and had it returned, but it then lay in pieces, neglected once more, until very skillfully restored by a later rector. The Reverend Midwinter had the Hales Chapel renovated in 1935, and the alabaster altar was moved to its present position and restored by his own hand. One of the charms of Tunstall Church is the life-size white marble recumbent effigy of Sir Edward Hales. His face is full of character, strength and humour. Although not born here, he certainly left his mark on Tunstall. He was involved in national political events from a young age. By his second marriage and by the marriage of his son, both with Cromer ladies, the Hales became lords of the manor here. They were one of the most prominent families in the county, part of a small group, much interrelated by marriage, who led Kentish society. The inscription on the tomb reads, "Here lieth Sir Edward Hales of Tunstall, in the county of Kent, knight and baronet, who died 6th October 1654, in the 78th year of his age." Some funeral armour is mounted above the memorial, as was customary for gentry and aristocracy. Sir Edward married for a second time in 1616. His bride was Martha Cromer, the rich widow of Sir James Cromer of the memorial. The couple lived at Grove End and had no children. George Bridges Moore was born into a wealthy family. He was ordained in 1833, became curate of Tunstall in 1835 and became rector in 1837, remaining until his death in 1885. He had the old rectory demolished and a new one built. This is what we now know as Cedar House opposite the church. It is an elegant, attractive yellow brick house set well back from the road. The front boundary wall is flint, echoing the churchyard wall opposite. It was the third rectory to be built on more or less the same spot. One of the projects dear to the rector's heart was the provision of a school for the village children, which he achieved in 1846. Another of his projects, which also left a lasting mark on the village, was the restoration of the church, and he did not stint in spending his own considerable means on it during the late 1840s and 1850s. No doubt Tunstall's greatest benefactor, he died in November 1885, aged 77, after 48 years as rector, and shares his Tunstall grave with his second wife, Charlotte, who died in 1851. There is a tablet to their memory in the chancel. Apparently, Bridges Moore was sadly unpopular in the parish, despite all he had done for the villagers. It was said that the only occasion on which he gave real pleasure to his parishioners was when he had the misfortune to walk into the Coffin Pond whilst returning from Sittingbourne one dark night. In 1886, the Reverend John James Horatio Septimus Pennington, a Cambridge graduate, was appointed rector here. He was a great-grandson of the Reverend Thomas Pennington, who had been rector of Tunstall for 36 years during the 18th century. On the north wall of the chancel, close to the pulpit, are two plaques placed there by the Reverend John. One commemorates his great-grandfather, the Reverend Thomas Pennington, the earlier rector of Tunstall. The other records the death of 20-year-old Adam Pennington, a keen sportsman and eldest son of John Septimus, in a bathing accident at Sheerness. The bell ringers of Tunstall played an important part in the life of the church, which has a strong tradition of ringing. From 1811 until 1872, an annual payment of £1 to the ringers is shown in churchwardens' accounts. The 5 bells were recast in 1843 into a ring of 6 by Thomas Mears of London. In 1899, Tunstall Church Ringing Society was founded and raised money for a metal frame for the bells. The ringers gave their monthly ringing pay and Christmas boxes to the appeal. It took less than a year for the society to be able to ring their first peal from the tower on the 22nd of December 1900, conducted by their captain, William Wilkins. The early years of the century were a flourishing time for the ringers. Bands of them had grown up at Sittingbourne, Upchurch and Bodmersham, and they regularly joined together and rang peals in local towers. At the expense of Charles Homewood of Ufton Court, 2 treble bells were added to make 8 in 1923. During 1975, the church bells were restored and rehung in a new steel frame at the Whitechapel Bell Foundry, retuned and rededicated. Unfortunately, the retuned bells were a failure, a bitter disappointment for the ringers. The bells became known as the Tunstall Dustbins, and a peal there was considered a penance by local ringers. The parish ringers continued to be above the average, arguably the best band in the county playing on arguably the worst set of bells in the county. At last, in 1995, they were recast and became once more a pleasure to hear, as they remain today. The Reverend Arthur Midwinter was appointed rector in 1928. Midwinter spent a good deal of time and effort on the interior decoration of the church, mixing his own paint and tinting the east window to tone down the colours. He was a skilled carpenter, and it was he who put the panelling around the altar area. Midwinter cared passionately about Tunstall and wrote a series of articles on the history of the parish, which appeared in the parish magazine under the heading Our Village between 1935 and 1937. They were then published in book form together with some of his attractive architectural drawings. It was he who first wrote of the need for a built-out vestry, so it is fitting that the Midwinter Room is named after him. Father Vernon Allen came to Tunstall as rector in 1957, living at first at number 1 Flint Cottages, whilst the new rectory was being built to replace the old. The old rectory sank into disrepair and was vandalised. Eventually it was beautifully restored and named Cedar House as it is today. Peter Bedell gave us something of the character of the Reverend Allen when he recounted, "He cared little for material and worldly things, and sometimes found it difficult to accept that people generally might not be quite as devout as he himself was. He was absolutely devout, celibate, and with no understanding of family life. If someone was missing from church, he would be on their doorstep next day to find out why, striding out, whatever the weather, a tall figure in elderly cassock and black beret to make visits, unremitting in his visits to the sick at home or in hospital." Vernon Allen retired after 20 years in 1977 at the age of 70, and he is buried in Tunstall Churchyard. The hanging rood in the chancel is by the ecclesiastical artist Martin Travers and was placed there in memory of Peter Downes, a young man and a strong Christian who died aged 20 in 1966. As a boy, Peter was a bell ringer and chorister here. The rood was given by the Reverend Allen. The Reverend Bill Shergold, the Biking Vicar, was the most famous rector the parish has ever had. Clad in black leathers astride his trusty Triumph motorcycle, Shergold ministered to the rockers of East London as leader of the 59 Club. After ordination in 1942, he began his ministry as curate in the East End before being appointed Vicar of All Saints, Hanworth, West London, where he served for 10 years. During the 1960s, as the Ton-Up Vicar, or the biker priest, he was quite a celebrity. Shergold held services for the bikers, who called him Father Bill. He compared them to medieval knights, suggesting that they should uphold the same ideals of courage, courtesy and chivalry. He addressed them from the pulpit and blessed their machines, parked neatly in the aisles. He went from London to Dover, and then in 1978 to Tunstall. It must have been quite a contrast to go from city parishes with a biker community to a conservative rural community with 2 colonels as church wardens. But in Tunstall, the Reverend Shergold is remembered as a quiet, reserved, academic man, gentle, single and dedicated not only to his work as parish priest, but also to the finer arts, antiques and his garden. He never felt quite at home here. But during his time he oversaw the merger of Tunstall with the parish of Robmasham. The Reverend Shergold retired from Tunstall at the end of 1983, and although he was 64, he felt called to return to his old parish at Poplar, unpaid. When he died in 2009 at the age of 89, he merited a lengthy obituary in the Daily Telegraph. Today, Tunstall Church is part of the benefice of Tunstall and Bredgar, incorporating 7 local church parishes. If you have found this video interesting, please subscribe to our YouTube channel or visit our website.